Good morning and welcome to the final day of Global Health Security Innovation Week at South by Southwest 2022, brought to you by host organization, the Texas Global Health Security Innovation Consortium. Before we get started with our keynote speaker, I would like to take a second to recognize our foundational sponsors, All Clear ID, CVS Health, and Pandemic Tech, and our gold sponsors, the Norwegian Consulate General of the Consulate General of Norway in Houston, and SLW. Thank you very much for joining us as we head into our final exciting day of content. We are very, very honored today to be hearing from Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Peter Hotez is Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he's also co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and the Texas Children's Hospital Endowed Chair of Tropical Pediatrics. Dr. Hotez, we would like to also congratulate you on your recent nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. And we very much look forward to hearing what you have to share with us today about vaccines and really, your experience throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and even before. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Hotez. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thanks so much, Lisa, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to not doing these things virtually one day and doing these things in person at South by Southwest. I know that'd be a lot of fun and meaningful. Maybe I'll speak for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we can open it up and try to do the discussion for the rest of the hour if that works for people. And so less on the PowerPoint, more on the discussion. So sharing now. Let's see how that works. All right, so just a word about who we are. So I'm a professor, I'm an academic at Baylor College of Medicine, where I'm a dean of the School of Tropical Medicine, but I also co-direct with my science partner for the last 20 years, Mary Elena Bottazzi, this very interesting center for vaccine development that we first started 20 years ago. And the idea behind it is we will make the vaccines that a lot of the pharma companies are not in a position to make because they're mostly for diseases of poverty, diseases such as schistosomiasis and hookworm and Chagas disease and leishmaniasis. And we're based in the labs of the Texas Children's Hospital, which is on the campus, of course, of the Texas Medical Center, linked to Baylor College of Medicine. And about 10 years ago, we started working on coronavirus vaccines because they were orphaned just like our parasitic disease vaccines are. And our major approach, unlike a lot of the other technologies you hear about, is to use approaches that are already in place for producing vaccines in low and middle income countries. So places such as Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia and India and Brazil and Argentina, China, all make their own recombinant protein hepatitis B vaccine, which is made through microbial fermentation and yeast. It's a vegan process, no animal cells or human cells. And you can produce very good vaccines with this approach. And because that's the case, and it's also low cost, probably the lowest cost of all vaccines. So we've adopted that for our parasitic disease vaccines and build in ways to even reduce the cost even further. And then we started doing this for SARS and MERS, and then we got the COVID-19 sequence, as you'll hear about in a little bit. Then we pivoted and made a COVID-19 vaccine using that sequence, which is now, I think, the lowest cost COVID-19 vaccine. It's about 145 rupees a dose in India, which is $1.90. So we've been trying to pioneer this approach of what I sometimes call the anti-poverty vaccines, especially for the chronic and debilitating parasitic infections that I just mentioned. The idea that these diseases both occur in the setting of poverty and cause poverty for their chronic and debilitating effects. And that's actually the first book I wrote, which is now in its third edition, called Forgotten People, Forgotten Diseases, that talks about the landscape of these conditions. Now, with regards to COVID-19, which has occupied a lot of our time lately, we are getting extraordinary numbers of deaths, and the current confirmed cases is around 5-6 million, but that's considered an underestimate. So the Institute for Health Metrics or The Economist has put it more closer to around 20 million deaths and maybe as many as 4 million deaths in India alone. So this has just been a devastating pandemic. In the U.S., the also been one of the hardest hit countries in terms of a million deaths expected within a few weeks, and probably 90,000 deaths in Texas, and will likely hit 100,000 deaths at some point this year. And so it's been one of the greatest catastrophes to ever affect the state of Texas. And what troubles me the most, I think, is the fact that about a third of those deaths, or a quarter or a third, occurred after vaccines became widely available by May 1. So after May 1 last year, anyone who wanted to get a vaccine could, and yet people chose not to get vaccinated. And so this was totally unnecessary. And we can divide those deaths based on peaks, and anything to the left of the big arrow before May 1, 2021 were clearly deaths from mostly unvaccinated, almost all unvaccinated people from COVID. And then afterwards is mostly those who refuse to get vaccinated, or which I sometimes call death from vaccine refusal or anti-science. And, I don't even know what kind of words you use to describe this. It's more than misinformation or disinformation. We'll talk about some of the forces that drove this terrible situation, the world's largest self-immolation, deaths that did not have to happen. And I'll talk about my efforts to go up and can combat some of the anti-science aggression that we're now seeing in Texas and elsewhere globally. The other piece, aside from the deaths, that I do not think we give enough attention to is the long COVID signs and symptoms. And I've been talking a lot about this article that came out as a preprint in medRxiv almost a year ago, and now it's finally just got published in Nature. And it talks about a very interesting study that the British neurologists did at Oxford University. Because of their national health system, they had a catalog of 40,000 magnetic resonance images pre-pandemic. And then as individuals started getting COVID, they could bring them back to rescan them. So it's kind of a perfect before and after study. And it's really troubling to see the reductions in gray matter thickness in certain parts of the brain, reduction in global brain size, and associated with cognitive decline as well. And I don't think we talk enough about this, because in some ways, the hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths are the beginning. This is also going to continue to haunt us, I fear, for a long time. And there's also quite a lot of interesting science now going on to understand the neurocognitive effects of COVID-19 and the gray matter brain degeneration and studies. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've been really intrigued by a lot of these studies looking at microglial activation, autoimmunity, autoantibodies, maladaptive cytokine profiles. And I think this is going to give us a lot of insight on this whole infection brain axis, including things like chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia. I think we're going to learn quite a bit because of these very important studies. Now, where are we at? Well, everyone's kind of high-fiving themselves because the numbers are in the US and in Texas have come down so dramatically, and that's absolutely true. And I'm very excited about that as well. And I was feeling good, hoping we'd be good for a few months, but I am quite troubled now about the fact that we're starting to see a rise yet again in parts of Europe, in Austria, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, Greece, and the UK. And the reason I'm troubled is oftentimes what happens in Europe, especially Western Europe, is ultimately reproduced a few weeks later in the US. And they are seeing this steep rise again. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is attributed to the BA.2 subvariant of Omicron. So I am cautiously watching this situation in the US to make certain it's not going to go up in the next few weeks. The BA.2 subvariant is accelerating in the US. It's still a minor variant, but where it's appeared, it goes up pretty quickly. So we'll have to see as we head into the end of March or into April whether we're going to have to be dealing with this BA.2 variant. And then in the longer term, I'm still concerned on the right about this summer, because in the summer of 2020 and 2021, we've seen variants of concern arise from abroad in both in the southern United States and Texas in both 2020 and 2021 in the summer. So I think, aside from this BA.2, even beyond that, even if once we get past it, we're still vulnerable because we're failing to vaccinate the world. And we know that Delta rose out of an unvaccinated population in India, Omicron out of an unvaccinated population in Southern Africa. So I'm worried that for this summer in the southern states and Texas, we could be in for it. And then in the longer term, on the left, I'm looking at this very early paper that Mark Lipsich's groups at Harvard School of Public Health put out in the pandemic. And to me, it makes a lot of sense. What their group did was to look at upper respiratory coronaviruses pre-pandemic and show that they have this seasonality to them in the Northern Hemisphere, January, February peaks. And I think we have to give some serious, looking at those two upper respiratory coronaviruses, OC43 and HKU1, I think we have to recognize that that could be the pattern that we wind up seeing here in the United States. So 3 concerns moving forward: the BA.2, and that's in the immediate horizon. We'll see how that, if that starts to accelerate, then the summer for variant to be determined in the southern states and Texas, and then for the rest of the country, for the entire country, next January, February, seasonal peaks. And those are the 3 pieces that I'm looking at right now. And a lot of this is happening because we are failing to vaccinate the world's low and middle income countries. The African continent is essentially unvaccinated, and same with many parts of Southeast Asia, Central America, the tropical regions of South America, the Caribbean, Haiti, Jamaica is largely unvaccinated. So this is our vulnerability, where new variants are going to start to arise. And I think part of that is because we never really came to terms with the magnitude of what needed to be done and think like we did, which was to use systems that are in place for making vaccines in low and middle income countries. There wasn't that awareness that with 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, almost as many in the poor regions of Latin America and low-income Asian countries, we're talking we need vaccine doses for 2 to 3 billion people, or 6 to 9 billion doses of vaccine. And I think the focus always was on the new technologies and innovation and speed. And we got that. We got some very interesting mRNA and adenovirus and particle vaccines. But, as any engineer will tell you, if you rely exclusively on new technologies, there's a learning curve before you go from 0 to 9 billion. So, I'm all for innovation as well, but I think we went too far tilt in that direction without having that situational awareness of what we need to do to vaccinate the world. So as I sometimes say, to drive home the point, we went heavy on the right, the RNA particle vaccines, and adenovirus vectored vaccines, the shiny new toys, and not having enough quality matchbox cars. Old school vaccines like protein subunits vaccines in some ways can work just as well or better than some of the new technology vaccines, but could be scaled immediately in low and middle income countries. And I think that was a policy failure. It wasn't the COVAX sharing facility so much as it was an upstream science policy failure. And that's what we've been working to take care of. We've, like a lot of our vaccines, through microbial fermentation and yeast, we do other systems as well, mammalian cells and insect cells. But we find that yeast seems to be our workhorse because of low cost. We made just like we made for SARS and MERS, we made the receptor binding domain of the spike protein. So if you look at the spike protein, that green component, on aluminum hydroxide with a second immunostimulant, either a CpG oligonucleotide or TLR7 agonist from the 3M companies. We're often limited on the access to the adjuvants that we had, but we found that these vaccines were highly effective in non-human primates against challenge infection, as good as any vaccine that's out there. high levels of virus neutralizing antibody, phase 1 through 3, lowest cost, ease of production, and tech transfer. And then now this has been released through emergency use listing in India. And tomorrow it's going to start going into the arms of kids in India, which we're very excited about. And then with subsequent plans for Indonesia, Bangladesh, and the African continent. So it's a vaccine specifically designed for low and middle income countries. And so this is what we've been doing the whole pandemic, is our own version of Texas vaccine diplomacy with India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and South Africa. With India, that's a company known as Biological E, and they're producing it as Corbevax. With Indonesia, it's Biopharma, and they're making a halal version of the vaccine. With Bangladesh, it's Incepta, and with Southern Africa, it's with Immunity Bio. And the way we do this is we do the technology transfer. We help them in the co-production and the co-development without any patent. We do everything open source. So we report all of our findings on how we developed the vaccine in the open literature with about 5 publications. And then we hand it off to them and help them in some of the assay development. Then they scale it up to produce it, and they own it. So, the company in India, Biologically, owns Corbevax, and they work it out with their regulators how to do the testing and report the results. And same with Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Southern Africa. So getting away from this big pharma model, what we sometimes call decolonizing the whole system, has been our approach. And we think that's a very effective way. It's not that the multinational companies are doing anything wrong. It's just that I think there's this mistaken idea from the policymakers that you don't only the multinational pharma companies can do this, and eventually the crumbs filter down to the low and middle income countries, and that clearly failed miserably in this pandemic. And we think there's a better way, and that is to balance the ecosystem with approaches like ours. So this is Corbevax. As I say, it's been released now through emergency use listing in India, and now it's been emergency use listed for 12 and up, and so it's going into 12 and up arms tomorrow, according to BioE and what we're seeing in the Indian press. So that's really exciting for us, and it's giving levels of virus neutralizing antibody that are as good as mRNA or close to it, and better than the adenovirus vectored vaccines. Also holding up better versus the variants and T cell responses, and also durability of protection. So we think this will also be not only a standalone adult vaccine and pediatric vaccine, but also as a booster for vaccines that are not holding up that well against the variants, like the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. In fact, our studies were done as a superiority study with the AstraZeneca vaccine, or some of the Chinese whole inactivated virus vaccines. Hopefully this can be used as a booster to help individuals who've already gotten those vaccines. And now we have a new exciting partnership with Immunity Bio, which is a US-based company, but they're building capacity in South Africa and Botswana. And in Botswana, through their innovation hub on the Kalahari Desert, they're scaling up production of vaccines, and now are taking ours on as well, possibly starting with fill and finish of Corbevax from India. So it's South-South partnership that we're quite excited about. And then we're also looking now for next year at a universal coronavirus vaccine. And that would be pretty exciting as well for us to use the same approach. So now we're also in this difficult situation where we're trying to take on some of the big social determinants that are promoting disease. And this is my latest book. It's called Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science. And what it does is look at some of the big drivers of disease. And the one that I want to finish talking about is this terrible rise in anti-science. And I got involved in this in an interesting way because I have 4 adult kids, including Rachel, has autism. and intellectual disabilities. And a few years ago, I wrote a book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, to kind of stand up to the anti-science aggression that made me a big target from anti-vaccine groups. But I learned a lot about doing it. So I became not only an expert in vaccine science, but vaccine anti-science. And that has given me a lot of ideas of what's been going on now in the last 2-3 years during the pandemic, which is causing so much loss of life. So I thought I'd take you and finish up by taking you through that. The anti-vaccine ecosystem has changed over the years. It started as version 1.0, claiming that vaccines cause autism, and that started with a publication of a paper that turned out not to be true in the Lancet in 1998. So the first version was small groups, grassroots groups claiming that vaccines cause autism, and we did a lot to diffuse that. But then about 10 years ago, these anti-vaccine groups had grown in size and stature, and they took on a political dimension, which is version 2.0. And then version 3.0, now we've got the full-on globalization of this empire. And that I'm really worried about because this is now really hurting our ability to vaccinate the world. So let me just take you through version 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. So 1.0 is this idea that the MMR vaccine it started out claiming that the MMR vaccine was causing kids to acquire autism. And there were a lot of studies that were done that showed that kids who got the MMR were no more likely to develop autism than kids who didn't, and vice versa. But the problem was the anti-vaccine groups started to monetize the internet, and they just kept on pivoting this or switching this around or playing this kind of pyrrhic game of whack-a-mole or moving the goalposts, and they switched it around to thimerosal preservative. And again, the scientific community responded in a big way, and then it was spacing vaccines too close together, then alum in vaccines. And this was exhausting, but I think it did have some effect at kind of diffusing the anti-vaccine movement. Then they even switched it up to HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers, claiming that it caused infertility and autoimmunity. And if that sounds familiar for COVID-19 vaccines, that's where they got it from. They just copy pasted the false assertion onto COVID-19 vaccines. And I got involved because this is my daughter Rachel, and wrote this book about Rachel's autism and intellectual disabilities. And in the book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, we go into the science showing there's no link, but also the fact that we did whole exome sequencing on Rachel and my family, and we're able to identify a new autism gene, which is a neuronal spectrin, a non-red cell spectrin, which is a neuronal cytoskeleton protein similar to some of the other autism genes. So to give that alternative narrative. And I think that did help diffuse the movement, although it created a lot of aggression. And I became forever known as the OG villain, the original gangster villain by anti-vaccine groups. But I think it was an important service. The problem is that anti-vaccine groups found a way to re-energize, and they re-energized in ways that at the time were not intuitively obvious to me, which was they became a political movement. So in Southern California by 2012, 2013, so many kids were opted out of getting vaccinated because the parents thought they were worried about vaccines causing autism, that a large measles epidemic hit Orange County and Marin County, and that caused the California legislature to shut down vaccine exemptions. And this generated version 2.0 of the movement, where there was a rebound and said, hey, you can't tell us what to do about our kids. And they promoted this sort of phony concept of health freedom or medical freedom. And that's what's still with us today, because then they started taking PAC money, political action money, from the Republican Tea Party, and also from far right groups. And it may have started in Southern California, but it really accelerated across the state of Texas. And so Texas became kind of the epicenter of the anti-vaccine movement, with more than 70,000 kids denied access to their vaccinations, especially in the Austin area and up in some of the North Texas counties. We even had our own anti-vaccine political action committee raising money from far-right donors. And it was a very destructive movement. And that's what's with us today. So during this, in the COVID pandemic, it enlarged beyond childhood vaccinations to go up against COVID-19 vaccines and spread across the country. And what you started to see was anti-vaccine sentiments openly expressed by the nighttime Fox News anchors, and they started going after me on a pretty regular basis, but also far-right members of the House of Representatives, including what you heard at the CPAC conferences, which they said vaccines are nothing more than political instruments of control, or first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounded to us, it's, there was a segment of the country that believed it. And so what you started to see was this open defiance of getting vaccinated. And so after May 1, even after all the vaccines became available, people were openly defiant. And these are studies that were reproduced by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Pew Research Center, you name it, the New York Times, National Public Radio, Charles Gaba, who's a health data analyst. And it's even gotten the name of Red COVID, and it shows that the redder the county in terms of voting, the more likely you are to die of COVID because you were refusing vaccines. So refusing vaccines almost became like a sign of political allegiance to the far right, and which was incredibly self-defeating and deadly. So now I estimate that over from May 1 to the end of 2021, roughly 200,000 unvaccinated Americans needlessly lost their lives to COVID-19 because they were defiant and they refused it. And now, if you take into account the Omicron wave, we're probably pushing closer to 250,000 needless deaths. So when I look at some of the big social determinants of death in the U.S. or globally, whether it's global terrorism or nuclear proliferation or cyber attacks, right now, anti-science aggression is by far killing more young and middle-aged adults in the United States than any of those forces. And unfortunately, now it's moving it's gone global to Canada and Western Europe, and this is one of the hardest things as an academic to talk about, because all of our training as physicians or physician scientists says you're not supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats or conservatives or liberals. We're supposed to be above that or beyond that, but I haven't found a way to talk about it other than to talk about it. And it's not that I'm politicizing vaccines; they are, and I'm basically saying, look, you're entitled to your conservative viewpoints, but don't adopt this one. Don't adopt this anti-science, anti-vaccine stance, because you'll lose your life. And it's become such a killer in the United States, and it's one of the toughest things I've had to go up against. And then the Fox News guys really go after you, and Breitbart goes after you, and it's followed by waves of hate emails and a lot of anti-Semitism linked to it as well. So because they know I'm Jewish, so I've had to bring in the Anti-Defamation League to help with specific individuals who are targeting me. So it's taken this very dark turn. And now, of course, that's not complicated enough. And now we have reports from U.S. and British intelligence showing how Putin and the Russian propaganda machine has been using this as a wedge issue to divide our country. And there's even a name for it. It's called weaponized health communication. And it's pretty well documented that there are other state actors involved as well, such as Iran and China, to some extent North Korea, but Russia seems to be the biggest offender in terms of filling our internet with anti-vaccine statements to use as a wedge issue to destabilize our democracy. So a very odd use of health communication. So I've been writing and speaking about this and the need for the Biden administration and the UN agencies to take this on. So far, the Biden administration has pretty much wanted to focus on the social media companies like Facebook And I think they do have a role in disseminating the information, but that doesn't address the source of the disinformation and who's generating it. And I think we need to pay more attention to that and find ways to go up against it. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has questions or however you'd like to proceed.
Hi, Dr. Hotez. We predictably have a ton of questions for you. I will start with a question from Dr. Laura Newcomb. Dr. Newcomb asks, efforts to make a universal influenza vaccine have persisted for decades, but still no product. Do you think a universal coronavirus vaccine will be possible?
Well, we're trying because, we've made a SARS-1 vaccine and a SARS-2 vaccine, and we can make other beta coronavirus vaccines. So the question is, if you bring those antigens together on an adjuvant platform, will you get this phenomenon of epitope broadening where it will make it more broadly cross-reactive? So that's one approach we're trying. We're also looking at consensus sequences of different coronaviruses. I mean, I do think, COVID-19 is our third major coronavirus of the 21st century. So we've had SARS-1, then SARS-2, and then MERS. And so I think it's likely we're going to have COVID-27 or COVID-38. So we should get ready for that. And I do think there's merit to trying to develop a universal coronavirus vaccine.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question, why aren't more people concerned about the long-term effects of COVID when considering whether or not to get vaccinated? How do you raise awareness about this issue?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the scientific community is divided on this point. So I tend to be on the far end of saying that, hey, it's, why am I getting my COVID vaccine? Well, of course, I don't want to be hospitalized or go to the ICU, but also I don't want to get long COVID. I don't want to have gray matter brain degeneration and cognitive decline. I've got things I want to do. So, but there's sort of a group that's kind of dug in that says, we have to tailor everything towards preventing hospitalizations. And that's where you get into disagreement about the role of boosters, because if you don't boost, you can still have a pretty big impact on reducing hospitalizations. But I think by boosting, you greatly reduce the likelihood of COVID infection and long COVID. And that should be the goal. But again, this also gets into not only the first booster, but also the second booster. And so I'm a proponent of giving 4 immunizations, a second booster. And but I get a lot of pushback. And in their defense, we don't have all of the data that we need right now. Only Israel is really looking at second boosters, but hopefully as the data comes in, and if it shows that, we'll head in that direction. And the other question is going to be, well, in the US, what do we do this in perpetuity? Do we have to immunize every few months with an mRNA vaccine? I don't know. I don't know how much of a problem this is because of Omicron or whether it's limited to the technology. And should we open up, our US vaccine program to other technologies to look at that? So I think, I don't want to use the term Operation Warp Speed, but I do think we should be looking at a vaccine development program 2.0 to see, what we're going to need as a nation, so we don't have to do boosters every few months. But it's been hard to persuade Health and Human Services to move in that direction unless there's things going on behind the scenes that I don't know about.
Got it. From Reese Duarte, who you met a little earlier, asks, how has research from past disease outbreaks contributed to the development of the Corbevax vaccine?
Well, we had an NIH grant in the 2010s to develop the SARS vaccine using that yeast fermentation technology. And we used that to show that modifications such as removing certain amino acids or modifying certain amino acids would increase production, prevent aggregation. And all of those efforts went into the COVID-19 vaccine. So, we had done a lot of work showing the spike protein as a target of the virus, how you deliver the spike protein. All of that is fed into our current generation COVID vaccine.
Oh, well, this question is very near and dear to my own heart. I have a 2-year-old at home. So the pandemic has been an interesting experience from, as a parent of a young child. When can we expect a vaccine for the under 5-year-olds? Will Corbavax be available for pediatric use? I think I remember you mentioning that the pediatric campaign would start tomorrow. So I'd love to hear details about that.
Yeah, well, that's in India. Right now,
Right.
we don't have a U.S. Production partner to do this and go through the FDA. We'd love it. Because I do think there would be interest in the U.S. We're certainly getting a lot of emails from people saying they would take our vaccine because it's older technology that they trust, but we just don't have a path. I think in part because I think the other pharma companies sort of see this market as flooded and don't see a business opportunity there, which is unfortunate. So I think for the mRNA pediatric vaccines, it looks to me like they're waiting for, on the under fives, are waiting for data on the third dose to move forward, because it looks like they're not getting the level of, at least for the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, the level of virus neutralizing antibodies that they had hoped with 2 doses. And it could be that they underdosed, because you remember they went from a 30 microgram adult dose to a 10 microgram in the 5 to 11 down to 3 micrograms in the younger kids. And when they went from 30 to 10, they also saw that in some younger groups, it really dropped off, and that may be happening again. So they might have underdosed a little bit. And then the question is, what do they do? Do they do another redosing scheme, or can you make up for that by giving the third immunization? And I think that's what we may be waiting for. And hopefully that those data will pan out soon.
And is that the same for Moderna as well, both Pfizer and Moderna in the mRNA space?
Moderna's been a little slower. There's much more RNA in the Moderna vaccine. It's 100 microgram instead of 30 micrograms. And I think for the younger kids, it's 50 instead of 100. So I think I don't have the inside baseball on what's going on, but they've been slower to move forward on that. They may be wanting to see more long-term safety data and make certain that myocarditis is not going to be a bigger issue because of the higher mRNA dose. So I think, I don't know that for a fact, but I think that may be slowing down the Moderna approvals, but I think it'll likely happen eventually.
Perfect. And then, but for Corbavax in India, what ages are you vaccinating?
Well, right now it's 12, it'll be 12 and up, but now additional studies are in place for the 5 to 11-year-olds. And so we're hoping that will come to light in the next few weeks. And could it ever be an infant vaccine or under 5? Well, hepatitis B is, and so it's a similar technology, so potentially. So all of those things are in play.
We had several questions along these lines. This one is from Dr. Del Mundo. What would be a key indicator of when we can say the pandemic is over?
I don't see us really getting there until we vaccinate the world, just because what we've seen for all the variants of concern arising out of unvaccinated populations. So that, I think that's holding us back. And, once we get through these waves, the BA2 wave and the summer wave, I think, we'll see if this is now going to become an annual event, or whether it'll tamp down as well, almost like the way influenza went, which the pandemic went for 4 or 5 years, and then eventually did turn into some type of seasonal influenza, but it was more manageable. We'll see if that happens, or if we really do a good job vaccinating the world, whether we can finally vaccinate our way out of this entirely until the next version of COVID comes along.
Follow-up question is entirely vaccinating the world, is that the only way? So I mean, I have a question here. It says, looks like denialism is keeping denialism to keep thinking that we're out of the woods with COVID. How do we keep the cycle from repeating? How do we break out of the cycle? I think these are all asking the same thing. Is it, will we have to get vaccinated for everyone? Will we have to reach out to the group to red COVID and to those people in order to escape this, certainly in the United States, but even
I think so. This is how we stopped measles outbreaks and polio outbreaks, right? We got a very high level of vaccine coverage. In the case of measles, more than 90%. So every kid was getting measles vaccination. And then when we stopped doing that, measles came back in 2019, for instance. So I think that's what we're looking at. I do think we can vaccinate our way out of it, but the bar is quite high, especially when you've got something so transmissible as Omicron or BA2, which is almost as transmissible as measles. It means, pretty much all of the adults and most of the kids. And And as long as we have that defiance, I think that's always going to slow us down. And that's why I say it's not just an academic discussion. A lot, are the stability of the country and lives are being lost. All depend on our ability to do a better job vaccinating.
This question is from Dr. Nerlinger. How has the COVID pandemic spurred new sources of investment in vaccine research, development, and production for low and middle income countries?
Well, I'm not sure it really has. I still think we're not in too different a situation as we were. So I think we have to do a better job decolonizing the vaccine ecosystem, and I'd like to see this taken up at a future G20 summit. So, there was an effort to create a global fund for vaccines. It's called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, based in Oslo and the UK. And maybe that's the problem. It's based in Oslo in the UK, and it's very much still focused on the industry model, giving supremacy and primacy to the pharma companies. And I think that's important. But again, I think we've got to figure out a way to really balance this out more to enable low and middle income country producers. The World Health Organization is now trying to create hubs in 6 African countries for mRNA. But even that, I think it's wrong to just now run to the mRNA basket, because you don't know for your next vaccine what's going to be the best technology. It could be that there are limits to mRNA, just like anything else. When this pandemic started, I was very excited about the VSV technology, vesicular stomatitis virus technology, led to the Ebola vaccine, which was such a good vaccine. And it stabilized the Eastern Congo. But that did not work well against COVID-19. And so who knows for the next pathogen coming around. So I think the key is to keep a balance of technologies in play, like vesicular stomatitis virus and particle vaccines, adenovirus and mRNA, but also some of the more traditional vaccines like protein subunit vaccines. That the more shots on goal we can have in that way, I think the better off we're going to be.
You mentioned CEPI. We actually heard from Tore Goodall in the opening session for this conference. I'm curious how you're working with international organizations like WHO and CEPI. What would their role be?
Well, CEPI has given some support to biological E, so we're grateful for that, but at relatively small amounts compared to the pharma companies. So CEPI has had some role in helping us, but the truth is on our side we had to rely on a lot of philanthropy based here in Texas to make this happen. We got support from New York Foundation, JPB Foundation, but it was a lot of local Texas philanthropies, like the Clayburgh Foundation helped us a lot. Tito's Vodka helped us an enormous amount. That was terrific. The Dunn Foundation, the MD Anderson Foundation. So those are the organizations that really helped us, and of course, the support of the Texas Medical Center and Texas Children's and Baylor. And so I think another sideline conversation or sideline narrative from this pandemic is, if it wasn't for the fact that we had moved to Texas, I don't think we would have had a COVID vaccine, because, the horsepower of the Texas Medical Center to get things done and the philanthropic environment of Texas has made a huge difference to us and made this possible.
That's very powerful.
Which, by the way, is a narrative that you don't hear about right on the cable news channels, right? You know how they portray us, right? They portray us as pretty, I've been on CNN, MSNBC every day, and what you hear about are about all the wackadoo stuff, and you don't hear about the fact that Texas is a state of science and innovation, and that's why we came to Texas. And so I think we need to do a better job in terms of public relations and getting that word out, that there is this very exciting side of Texas that not enough people hear about.
You absolutely took the words out of my mouth. Along the same lines, another question for Dr. Newcomb. How can scientists communicate to society better? On social media, I've been called arrogant for trying to tell people that what I know as a molecular virologist. I think we've all had this experience. As you suffered from putting yourself out in the public, thank you. How can scientists better communicate with society and not suffer for their efforts?
Well, I think we have to also change that whole science communication ecosystem. Because right now, the way it works, especially if you're at a university or academic health center, the message kind of is, well, we don't even like you speaking out. They don't really even like their scientists and their physicians speaking out. They want the Office of Communications at the universities and the academic health centers want to control the narrative. And then they'll finally say, well, look, we can't control your academic freedom. If you want to speak out on social media, write op-ed pieces or commentary pieces or speak on TV, we're not going to stop you, but ... you do it at your own peril. And that creates a very chilling effect. So the consequence is there are very few scientists kind of out there in the public domain. And that has created a vacuum. And guess what's filling the vacuum? Which is all the anti-vaccine, anti-science stuff, and that's what's dominating social media. What dominates the internet. So I think among the things we need to think about is better send a message to our young scientists that science communication and public engagement is valuable, and that means one, providing training at the doctoral and postdoctoral level, or at the medical school and residency level. Second, provide mechanisms, incentive mechanisms for people to communicate. So, I get evaluated annually like everybody else. And, at the university, and what do they ask me about? They ask me about my grants and papers, right? They're not asking me about, going on CNN or MSNBC, or my op-eds, or even my single author books, and certainly nothing about social media. So the message is, do it at your own risk. We don't value what you're doing. If you have to do it, but don't mess up. Otherwise, you're going to get spanked or slapped. And we've got to change that. I think, back when I got my MD and PhD in the 1980s in New York, the message was, you don't engage the public. You don't talk to journalists. That was seen as a form of self-promotion or grandstanding. And all those ideas were put in place before something called the internet came along. And now the world has changed. And I think people do need to hear from scientists. And the consequences are, and I keep going back to this, the consequences are deadly. Again, 200,000, maybe 250,000 Americans needlessly lost their lives due to anti-science aggression because there was no counterforce against it. And we have to do this to continue to save lives. And otherwise, we're going to see further erosions of science. I mean, you saw what Senator Rand Paul did, yesterday, the day before. He wants to break the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases into pieces, and use it as a way to fire Tony Fauci. And this is very aggressive. And basically, people are looking at science as something that's expendable for political gain or for political expediency. And I say, look, one of the reasons why we're a great nation is because of our research institutes and research universities. And this helped, this is what helped us win the war on fascism in World War II, or the Cold War, or the war on AIDS. And this is what makes us a great nation. And so I say, when they say the army of patriots is going to hunt me down, well, first of all, I say, I don't know why you need an army of patriots. It's just me and Ann and Rachel and the cat. So one or two patriots should be enough. But the other thing I say is, I said, look, we're the patriots. The scientists are the patriots, not these chuckleheads. So I think we need to be able to stand our ground and make that point. But right now we don't have an ecosystem that makes us feel comfortable doing that.
Interesting. It's fascinating. Nandita Shetty has asked this: have you set a trend for open source vaccines, and will we see more of these in the future?
I wish. We're still struggling, right? I mean, there's no roadmap for this either. That's, I think the other problem. So it's very much seat of the pants. So we'll see if it does blaze a path, but it's tough. It's tough because, the big donor funds are still very much focused on the multinational pharma companies. The multinational pharma companies have the horsepower to lobby Congress or to lobby the European parliaments and the UK Parliament. And so, every step of the way, we're sort of at a disadvantage. So we'll see, what kind of lessons learned will come out of what we're doing. But it's been a really interesting ride. It's been tough, especially early on in the pandemic when we knew we had an important approach, but just got locked out of Operation Warp Speed and a lot of the G7 funding, just because it was so dominated by a failed science policy framework that insisted only the pharma companies could do this, only with lots of intellectual property and complex patents and that sort of thing, and no transparency in terms of how they make these vaccines. And I think that, and it's not that the multinational pharma companies are bad guys. They make a lot of vaccines for the Gavi Alliance, and the world depends on them. And they made a lot of interesting vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the end, they made enough vaccine to vaccinate the Northern Hemisphere, or North America and Western Europe. And we need to broaden that to be more inclusive, especially of partner of nonprofit product development partnerships like ours and the vaccine producers in low and middle income countries. It'll make for a healthier vaccine ecosystem.
Wonderful. I have one final question, and it's a doozy. So before the events of the last, several months, we were still in the midst of this behemoth of a problem that you have elucidated throughout this talk. And then we had an introduction of yet another humanitarian crisis. So I'd love to hear your comments about the war in Ukraine. It's creating an enormous humanitarian crisis, which also creates a public health crisis. So now we have a twin, triple, quadruple demic. So what do you have anything to share about that, about the complexities that creates?
Sure. Actually, my father's family is from Western Ukraine, actually from Tarnopol. So I've been following this pretty closely. Yeah, it's well, obviously it's a horrific humanitarian tragedy, and I think everybody who's watching the cable news channels or tuning into the news knows that. But I think I'm worried about a lot of other instability in terms of pandemic threats. I mean, Ukraine and Russia have not handled their COVID situation well. So all of the people living under duress and in crowded conditions underground, living in subways, we know historically that in my book, I showed conflict as a great driver of disease. So generating new COVID variants and new pandemics altogether. I think there's a history of that, both from World War I, World War II. Then second, the mental health effects, which are going to be so devastating. And right now, Europe is about to experience another big BA2 subvariant wave. So that's also going to destabilize Europe even further at a time when we need to be working together to combat this pandemic and future pandemics. So the timing is not good. And so I think, we are in for a period of great instability, unfortunately. And listening to the political scientists about how they think this is going to end, I just don't see an obvious way that this ends quickly. So it's incredibly depressing, but there are these elements of heroism that we are seeing with the leadership of Ukraine. Listening to Doctors Without Borders, MSF, working under incredible duress, and the doctors and healthcare professionals who are staying there. It is very moving. I think we're going to have to continue to support the scientists in Ukraine, because with losing all that science and in the countries around it, I think that would be a loss as well. So yeah, there are a lot of things that affect every branch of life, including the life sciences.
So we have time for your final comments. I would love to hear from you. You have an audience of of global health scientists, of innovators, of of stakeholders in this global health security community. What final guidance or a if we left with one instruction for how to interact with our with our patients, with our networks, what would that be?
Well, I think my two themes were empowering science in low and middle income countries. We've clearly seen the problems of not doing that, but also combating anti-science. I think anti-science is now going to be a formidable element in what we do on a day-to-day basis, and 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 we have to recognize it for a social force that's as dangerous as anything else that we have to face. And so far the scientific societies, even the national academies, have not really stepped up to this, in part because their commitment to staying politically neutral, and they see how this is happening along a partisan divide. They use this as a reason not, as just to quote, stay neutral. But as Elie Wiesel says, neutrality always favors the tormentor or the aggressor, and that's what's happening. So I think we really need our scientific societies to both step up their game in terms of science communication, and to be more vocal and outspoken and more aggressive in terms of how we combat anti-science. Otherwise, there's going to be continued erosion of our scientific profession.
Tremendous. Thank you so much. I mean, it's been an honor to interact with you and to be the person in this case who's relaying questions to you. So I know that our entire audience has been absolutely thrilled to hear from you, to hear your perspectives on this. Thank you very much for joining us again, and best wishes in the Nobel Prize. So
oh, thanks. I haven't bought my tickets for Oslo yet, but
oh, well, you should make it happen.
So anyway, thanks to Text GHS and GHS Innovation Week. It was a great hour, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Okay.